DW Africa Link.
Hope or hype? That's the question echoing across Nigeria as President Bola Tinubu mulls over borrowing billions of dollars to jumpstart the economy. Amid rising inflation, a weakening naira, and growing public distrust, the government promises that this new wave of borrowing could restore stability, create jobs, and rebuild a nation under strain. But can another debt-driven push truly fix the cracks, or will it deepen them? That's what's coming up. Stay tuned. My name is Josey Mahachi. Welcome to Africa Link, the podcast that connects you to the stories that matter from Africa.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
Nigeria's public debt is projected to exceed 162 trillion naira following President Bola Tinubu's request for new loans of 21.5 billion US dollars, along with a 65 million euro grant. This latest borrowing push, on top of earlier loans, has sparked growing concern over debt sustainability, especially among young Nigerians facing rising inflation, limited job opportunities, and economic uncertainty. So, what does this proposed mega loan plan mean for the average Nigerian? And is it the beginning of economic renewal or just more political theater? Joining me for the conversation is Mma Amara Ekeruche, Senior Research Fellow, Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, CSEA, and DW correspondent Abiodun Jamiu in Abuja to unpack what Nigeria's mounting debt means for development, employment, and the country's long-term financial stability. I'll start with you, Abiodun, just to tell us about this particular story as you pitched for it.
Okay, thank you so much, Josey. The government wants to use this new loans request to actually finance critical infrastructure, such as agriculture, health, education. So a lot of Nigerians are actually skeptical about these loans because they don't actually see measurable impacts of what the previous loans have been about. So it has caused a lot of uproars among Nigerians asking questions why asking for these tons of loans. At the same time, asking for them when Nigerians soaring debt profile is still going up.
Now, Ma, as an analyst and expert, how sustainable is Nigeria's current debt trajectory, especially with this new borrowing request?
So the short answer is it doesn't look sustainable, and that's for several reasons. So typically, there are two main metrics by which you use to judge how sustainable a country's debt trajectory is. So the first is the debt to GDP, and the second is the debt service to revenue ratio. On the first metrics, the debt to GDP, we're actually doing fine. So the current data, that's without including the fresh or the new $24 billion loan, the current data shows that our debt to GDP ratio is 26%. And that's not surprising because we have a large economy. However, on the debt service to revenue front, we are not doing as well, right? So for instance, at the peak of COVID, we were spending over 80%, the federal government's revenue, over 80% of that was going towards debt obligations, right? So debt service payments. And that's mainly because we're overly dependent on a few commodities that generate revenue, i.e., oil, right? So oil accounts for a large share of our revenue. I think about 60% of our revenue, and even a larger share of our exports, right? Of our foreign exports earnings. I think that's about 80% of our export earnings. So inflation is over 20%. That's a major red flag, right? Typically, when inflation reaches that amount, it triggers currency depreciation, right? And that makes creditors ask request for higher interest rates, the naira has depreciated in the last 2 years like we haven't seen in in a while. For a country whose debt are mostly denominated in foreign currency, right? That means that in real terms we have to pay even more for principal payments and interest payments. We are growing far below the rates that our debt is growing, right? And so, if we're not careful, which I already think we are, we're going to enter into a refinancing risks where we are only taking on more debt just to be able to service existing debts. So, uh, even this investing in infrastructure that Abiodun is talking about, health, education, roads, if that's the case, then that's good. But more likely than not, it's the case where we are taking on more debt just to be able to stay afloat, not necessarily to invest in these critical sectors that Abiodun has pointed to.
Right, right. I remember a couple of weeks ago, I think we did actually another podcast with you, Abiodun, and I was actually celebrating when Nigeria's inflation had eased to about 23.71%. Though of course Abiodun and the other guests we had said no, but we cannot feel it in the pocket. So how then do you explain this whole borrowing as well, Mma?
The immediate effect is that it crowds out investments in critical infrastructure or critical sectors, right? So, for instance, the budget allocation for health, education, and I think, say, agriculture combined is still not up to the amount that is spent on servicing debts, right? And then with regards to inflation, the prices of nearly all commodities have skyrocketed in the last, I would say, even it's been increasing, but I would say even in the last 6 months, we've seen a significant increase in the rise of the prices of commodities. And worse still, salaries are not increasing in comparative levels, right? Even the minimum wage that was agreed to, not all companies are paying for it. I don't even think companies are now mandated to pay for it. No. So that 70,000 naira minimum wage, not all companies are paying for it, or not all businesses are paying their workers that. And even at that 70,000, it's difficult to survive, right? So at the micro level, these increments in debt levels that we're seeing, it is not affecting the average Nigerian more favorably.
Right, right. And I just also saw that the government says the loans will fund infrastructure, agriculture, and job creation. I noticed that a few months ago, probably 2 months, the president, Bola Tinubu, actually appointed a new CEO for Bank of Agriculture. But I'm just wondering, Ma, that do these sectors typically yield returns that justify such heavy borrowing?
Good question. Really good question. So not all loans should be paid back from the profits or the rents of the investments which was used to fund it, right? If we do that, sectors like education and health, right, they would always be underfunded because those sectors typically do not yield enough profits, basically. You can do that for infrastructure, even to an extent, because Africa is now seeing that agriculture is a business, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we want food sovereignty, we want to feed ourselves, but it's a business in and of itself. If we start producing, in extremely large quantities. However, once you have that understanding, then the question that comes in is, where are we borrowing from and at what interest rate are they giving us? So this $24 billion that the government is taking on, it's from the World Bank. And so most likely or more likely than not, it's going to be at a relatively lower interest rates. Typically, official creditors, or in particular multilateral creditors like the World Bank, the AFDB, all the multilateral creditors that exist, like education and health. So let's say the interest rate is 2%, 1%, 3%. That's good, but it may not be a good idea to issue Euro bonds, which the interest rates on average are like 10%, and then use that to fund education or health, right? Rather, you can use that to fund infrastructure, maybe a highway that can be tolled, so that's one way of getting.
But maybe they'll say, I saw last week they just commissioned the 30 kilometer.
Yes, the Lagos Calabar Coastal Highway.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be how many kilometers, like the final project?
I think that the 30 kilometers is 1/4 or so, or 1/5 of the entire project.
And now when you look at the money that was just used already for the 30 kilometers, meaning that to complete the whole project, there's just trillions needed. And these are some of also the projects that Nigerians are really talking about, if you even check on social media platforms. But I'll come back to you just to go to Abiodun. I mean, just to find out, Abiodun, what ordinary Nigerians are saying about the president's fresh loan request. His government says these loans will go into projects like rail, power, and healthcare. Are people seeing tangible outcomes from past borrowing?
Josey, that's the part of the problem. Why government continue to point to infrastructure projects as justification for borrowing, the average Nigerians does not see or feel the real impact, in their daily lives. In major cities, there are still commuters that are still finding it very difficult to transmute from one point to another because there are bad roads. So power outage remain widespread, and the cost of doing business because there are power outages are increasingly high. So a lot of Nigerians are really, really not in tune with the current loan request because there has not been any real impact from the previous loan request. So they are just asking that where are the past projects? When you look at rural communities across Nigeria, you'll see that some of these health facilities are in dilapidated forms. Some does not even have equipment to begin with. So there's a deep sense of fatigue. The trust gap is wide. People hear about billions being borrowed in the name of national development, infrastructure development, but the schools their children attend are nothing to write home about. The healthcare centers basically run without drugs. So for many, they don't really see the real impact. And in fact, when we look at the one they're just talking about that they're going to use it to fund rail and power, I mean, what is the Nigerian cities are not even connected to say. So if they are borrowing this money to power, how long are they going to wait before it kicks on? Because projects take long, and we don't even know this coastal road that we're talking about. We don't even know when it will be completed, even though there is a stipulated time for it to be completed. Most projects elongate more than necessary. So for Nigerians, there's a big disconnect between past what the president is borrowing and what they believe, and the trust gap is still feasible among Nigerians.
Right. Mayor, I don't know if you also want to add something on what Abiodun has just said, because this now still takes us to the issue about the transparency. Well, what role should the debt transparency and public accountability play in addressing this trend?
Great question, Josey. But before I respond to that, I want to correct something. So the entire Lagos Calabar Highway project is 700 kilometers. So the 30 kilometers that has just been inaugurated or launched is less than 5% of the entire project. So I just wanted to correct that before responding. With regards to the use of the fresh loans or existing loans, it's not very apparent how it's used. You can't draw a straight line from a specific loan to the project that it funded, right?
Is it really about borrowing or how the money is spent? I feel like from what I'm seeing in all the platforms where Nigerians are discussing these issues, it's about the amount of money that goes to a project that is probably just worth 500,000, but then it is being said it's 1 billion.
Yes, that's a very good point, and you're right. There's a report that says we spend significantly more on projects like, roads compared to our counterparts in the developed world, and also those projects take significantly more time, right? So yes, there is evidence that buttresses what you have just said, right? So there are leakages, there's corruption in the system, and I'm not to downplay that, but I would choose leakages, minimal leakages over a loan where you can't trace what the project was used for. So it's not even about the cost of the project anymore, but blatant thefts.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So,
Yeah.
yeah, blatant theft, as you say. But just to come back to you also, Abiodun, to find out some of the concerns or fears people raise about Nigeria's rising debt. I see them talking more about borrowing not being a sustainable development plan at all. Just give us some of those comments from some Nigerians and their concerns.
Oh, okay. A lot of people are actually concerns about how the government plans to pay back these loans. People worry that the growing debt burdens will lead to more taxes, more inflation, and even further cuts to public service. Because they feel like when we are servicing more debt, that money that should go into infrastructure or capital development will rather go into into cuts in public service and to service debt. So there's also the fear that the countries might end up in debt trap, borrowing to service old loans and without making real economic progress. But what is even much more concerning for people we spoke to in Abuja particularly, they are concerned about intergenerational debt. Like some of them are worried about that today's loan will become tomorrow problem for their children and grandchildren who will be paying back debt for projects that they never materialize. So it's a really big issue. So among those that are a little bit educated, like civil servants, some of them are even concerned about the lack of transparency and accountability in how these loans are spent. A common fear that borrowed money goes into some of these over bloated budgets that are even not worth it in the first place, and some are even siphoned off. Because before I used to track government projects before, where we go deep into the communities to see how projects fare. Sometimes you see that the Nigerian government or the legislature will sign off on a budget, like for instance, the consistency projects, for instance. The government will sign off on some of these projects, and you will go deep into this community to find out if these projects are going on. Unfortunately, you find that there is nothing on the ground to show for it. You will see dilapidated buildings and stuff. So there is this concern also among Nigerians that some of this money are definitely going to be leaving the country with debt but no development.
Right. Now, Emma, as we wrap up our discussions, just to find out from you, what other alternatives does the country have to borrowing? And most importantly, are there viable paths through tax reform, exports, or maybe domestic revenue generation?
For personal and corporate tax, I don't think that's a viable path because the private sector, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, are maxed out. The government can perhaps start looking into tax holidays or tax exemptions given to big companies, both indigenous companies and foreign companies. And that ties into what's going on the global stage or the global level with the United Nations Convention on Tax, where countries in the global south, led by Nigeria, are requesting that international companies are taxed as a single entity, one, and also that there is a minimum corporate tax that every international company should pay, right? And then moving on from that, value addition as well is very important if the government is serious about boosting domestic resources. So we have so many commodities, not only in Nigeria, but across the continent. Countries need to move up the value chain and better integrate into the global value chain of commodities, whether it's oil, whether it's cocoa or copper, just name it, all of that commodities. So those are my two main points.
Mma Amara Ekeruche, Senior Research Fellow, Center for the Study of Economies of Africa, CSEA, and DW correspondent Abiodun Jamiu, many thanks for joining us.
Get the stories that are shaping the continent here on Africa Link.
Now, you've heard what Nigerians think about the borrowing, the transparency, and the trust deficit that continues to grow. But what's the government's perspective? On the sidelines of the African Development Bank annual meeting in Abidjan, I caught up with Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Wale Edun. We talked about the broader economic strategy beyond the headlines. I asked him, how is Nigeria leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area to diversify its export base and reduce dependence on traditional trade partners? And how is the government responding to tariff-related challenges, including those stemming from U.S. trade policies under Trump? Here's what he had to say.
In the 2-year period of the President Tinubu administration, the distortions have been, my major macroeconomic distortions have been removed. The economy has been stabilized, and now it is set for growth. And that growth will also be export-led. Manufactured exports are a viable option for Nigeria at this time. Why? We have a stable exchange rate, and we have a competitive exchange rate, which makes manufactured goods made in Nigeria very, very price competitive for export to the West African region, as well as the continent of Africa as a whole, 1.4 billion people, obviously under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. As a member of ECOWAS and as a member of AFTA, there are tariff conventions which is our commitment to adhere to. And I think in this, as we move to improve the investment environment, the compliance with the common external tariff of ECOWAS and other tariff regimes that we are signatories to is something that we are moving squarely in the direction of, because if you are a producer, you want low tariffs or even no tariffs on your imports of raw materials, spare parts, and of course, capital equipment, such that can now be competitive when you export. So I think given where Nigeria is today, we are building momentum of investments in the Nigerian industrial sector in particular.
Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Wale Edun. The true value of these loans hinges on transparent use, effective oversight, and measurable economic returns. Without these, experts warn that borrowing could become a long-term burden rather than a driver of progress. That's it for this edition of Africa Link. Remember, you are not just a listener, but a part of our community, and your engagement can shape the direction of our discussions. We really value your insights and encourage you to share your thoughts with us. Remember, you can find all of the Africa Link podcast episodes on Spotify and Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts from. This episode was co-produced and edited by Eddie Micah Jr. My name is Josey Mahachi. Thanks for listening. Until the next one, it's bye for now.
DW News.
Here are today's top stories and why they matter. Security forces in Cameroon have shut down the city of Douala. Anti-riot vehicles have been deployed, and opposition leader Maurice Kamto has been